The Closet in Dorm Room 1113. Written and narrated by Jared Archibald. Music production and sound editing by Tyler Archibald. It was the fall of 2016, my first semester at college and my first time living away from home. Me and my best friend Tommy moved into a dorm room on campus together and life was great. We stayed up way too late every night eating microwavable food, playing video games, and partying with the other students on our floor. Halloween landed on a Monday that year, but that didn't stop us from throwing a wild rager. It wasn't a typical party, everyone on the floor was in on it. Some people even decorated their rooms to be all spooky. You couldn't walk 5 feet without running into a cooler full of beers or a bottle of gin. Parties like this were not allowed, but we knew we could get away with it on Halloween. I remember walking down the hallway with Tommy, going in and out of all of our friends' rooms. One room had Monster Mash blasting while they were playing drinking games. Another was lit with a blacklight as they attempted to hotbox the room with vape clouds. Whenever we had enough of one room, we just hopped over to the next one. It was like the college kids' version of trick-or-treating. After a few games of beer pong and way too many shots, I ended up crashing on somebody's beanbag. I don't know whose room I was in, but they had a cheesy horror movie playing on the TV and I got sucked into it. Somebody kicked the beanbag and I snapped back to reality. There you are. It was Sydney, the girl I sat next to in photography. She lived a few levels up and I invited her to the party earlier in the day. Though nothing had been said out loud yet, it was obvious that she had a thing for me. To be honest, I liked her too. I'll never forget how she looked that night. Dirty blonde hair tied back in a ponytail, black framed glasses, a t-shirt with a purple witch riding a broomstick, and a light gray denim jacket unbuttoned. You showed up! I was still laying down, bent backwards and looking at her upside down. How drunk are you right now? She crossed her arms and glared at me with mock disapproval. I just grinned ear to ear and chuckled. She helped me to my feet and I was hit with an intense wave of dizziness. After a few minutes of regaining control of my body, we joined back up with Tommy and everyone else for more games. No more drinking for me though, I was too far gone already. People were constantly coming in and out of our room, and I started to notice a trend in the conversations. They were all talking about room 1113. Dorm room 1113 belonged to a guy named Levi. He didn't have a roommate. It was just him in there and I never found out why. He was a weird one. The kind of guy to randomly derail a conversation into something completely unrelated and sometimes really dark. None of us were very close with him, but it wasn't like we hated him or anything either. I will admit though, if I knew he was going to be somewhere, I would make a point to avoid that place. Levi was hosting some sort of haunted house in his room that night. I just laughed and said fuck that when Sydney said we should go check it out. She looked up at me with a sad expression on her face. But I love haunted houses. You're not too scared, are you? She said with a sarcastic smirk. Of Levi Crawford? Yeah, I'm terrified. She laughed and we continued our game, but we kept hearing passing conversations about the crazy shit that was going down in Levi's room. I decided to ask Tommy if he knew anything about it. He told us that Levi was charging $5 for a trip into his haunted closet. Haunted closet? Are you for real? $5 to go stand in a rectangle? I thought he had to be joking. I haven't gone down to see it yet, but Chase was saying it's fucking crazy, man. Like I guess there's a whole other room connected or something, Tommy replied. This piqued Sydney's interest. A secret room in his closet? Nate, we have to go see it. The closet in room 1113 was the last place on earth I wanted to be, but Sydney was so excited, how could I say no? I pulled out my wallet to make sure I had a $5. I did. She lit up with joy and I rolled my eyes. Okay, let's go see this creepy closet. Tommy, if I'm not back in 20 minutes, you better call the police. He laughed and agreed. We walked down to Levi's room where we found a line of 5 people waiting outside the closed door. I asked them if they had been through yet, but none of them had. They all had stories from their friends though. Each story was different and completely unbelievable. I just chalked it all up to inebriated exaggeration. There's no way Levi Crawford was pulling off these Hollywood-level effects in his little homemade haunted house. Sydney interlocked her fingers with mine as we listened and gave my hand a squeeze. My heart leapt a bit. This was the first time we had ever held hands. I squeezed back and all feelings of regret disappeared. I remember thinking, hey, I guess this $5 isn't for nothing after all. The door opened and a lanky dude with an afro came out. He didn't say a word, but he was visibly shaking and his eyes were wide. Then he just slowly walked out the front door of the building. I don't know what he saw in there, but it must have been pretty bad. The 2 girls at the front of the line exchanged nervous glances with each other and then walked into the room, closing the door behind them. They were inside for about 10 minutes before the door opened again. They came stumbling out into the hallway. One was crying, and the other had her arm around her friend, trying to console her. We were all concerned and asked what happened. I don't know, replied the girl who wasn't crying. She got really scared by something, but I never saw it. She won't speak, and I don't know what to do. The next 3 people in front of us went in one at a time. The first was gone for 10 minutes too, but he came out fine. He actually laughed when he saw us. Pretty freaky shit in there. He chuckled and pointed his thumb back at the door behind him. Then it was Kate's turn, one of Tommy's many ex-girlfriends. She was gone for less than 5 minutes before the door swung open, unleashing an outburst of rageful yelling. What the fuck is wrong with you, Crawford? She barged out looking pissed. How could you do something like that, fucking freak? Levi peered around the corner. It's not real, Kate, I'm sorry. But she was already storming away. What the hell happened? I asked Levi. Sometimes things just seem really realistic, that's all. It's nothing to worry about. He gave a smile that was probably meant to reassure us, but it wasn't convincing. Nervously trying to move things along, he shifted his attention to the next in line. Colin, you're up next, buddy. Got the money? Actually, I just realized that I didn't bring my wallet. An obvious lie. Sorry, Crawford. He scurried away from the door, and then it was just me and Sydney. Levi shifted his gaze to us. I guess that means it's our turn, Sydney said, bouncing up and down with nervous excitement. I wanted to follow in Colin's footsteps, but she grabbed my arm and led me into Levi's room. Once the door closed behind me, I found myself trapped in an atmosphere of the pungent aroma of old takeout food and sweat. A wad of cash was sitting on his bed, surrounded by pizza boxes. He added my $5 bill to the pile and ushered us to the closet. I opened the door to reveal a super regular-looking closet. There were some coats hanging up, shoes on the ground, and no Halloween decorations. What do we do? I asked. Step inside and see what happens, Levi replied. I looked at Sydney and she stared back with a puzzled expression. I think she was finally having regrets, but it was too late to back out. We stepped inside the musty closet and Levi shut the door, engulfing us in darkness. We stood in silence for half a minute, and I let out a sigh. Is this some sort of joke, Levi? No response from the other side of the door. Maybe it's a puzzle, like an escape room, Sydney said optimistically. I don't see how that could be possible. Tommy said there was a secret room, remember? Tommy likes to talk out of his ass. He hasn't even been in here. I couldn't see a damn thing, but I could hear and feel Sydney fumbling around in the dark. She shuffled to the back of the closet, blindly patting the wall. Then she let out a gasp. Holy shit, there's a door! Suddenly, light poured into the closet. There was actually another room connected to Levi's. It looked just like a typical dorm room with the same colored walls, carpet, and light fixtures, but it was completely unfurnished. There was nothing in the room at all. This is so weird, Sydney said. Whose room is this anyway? I don't know, I guess nobody's using it this semester? Why the hell are the closets connected? That seems like a privacy issue. Maybe that's why it isn't being used. As we paced around the empty room, I was expecting a jump scare or something, but nothing happened. I realized that I couldn't hear the music playing from the hallway anymore, which was odd. I made my way to the front door and placed my fingers on the handle and hesitated. It hit me that this was the obvious path to take. Certainly, Levi had something set up on the other side of the door to scare anybody who opened it. I lowered my hand and looked through the peephole first. Complete darkness. The bastard taped over the peephole. What do you think Crawford put on the other side of this thing, Sid? I turned around and noticed that she was staring out the window. She didn't seem to hear me. Her full attention was fixed on something outside. I went over to her. Hey, you alright? Then I saw what she was looking at. Out in the field, something was staring back at us. It was dark, and the shape was hard to make out, but I could tell it was tall. Its eyes were glowing white, and its head looked deformed. We kept on staring at it, expecting it to move or something, but it didn't. That's a pretty good prop. I wonder how he made that thing. Where the hell are we, Nate? Her voice was shaky. What do you mean? This isn't our campus. My blood went cold. She was right. Why didn't I notice? This window should be facing the courtyard outside, and the other buildings should be visible. All we could see was an open field. I think I'm too drunk for this, Sid. Let's go back. She nodded, but kept her eyes glued to the figure outside. I grabbed her hand this time, and she jumped a little. But it broke her trance, and she finally looked at me. Her eyes were filled with genuine fear, and it was so quiet I could have sworn I could hear her heart racing, or maybe it was mine. We made our way back into the closet and began rummaging our way through Levi's things. My hand brushed up and down the smooth, textureless wall at the back of the closet, and my stomach dropped. Oh fuck. Oh fuck, fuck, fuck. I became frantic, feeling all over the wall that should have been a door. The handle was gone. I dropped to the floor, searching for the gap that should have been there, but my hand slid straight to the carpet. "What is it?" she asked, but she already figured it out before I could say anything. We slammed our fists on the wall in desperation, but nothing happened. We yelled so loud our ears hurt, but nobody heard. After a while, we just stood there in silence. Sydney broke it when she began to cry. I instinctively wrapped my arms around her and pulled her close. "Hey, it's gonna be okay. It's just a trick, right? We can figure this out. Like an escape room, remember?" I felt her head shake up and down against my chest, and her shoulders began to relax. We came back out into the empty dorm room, and I glanced out the window again. The figure was gone. Sydney noticed too. We looked at each other, but didn't say anything. I began scanning the room for any sort of clue on what we should be doing, but I couldn't find a single thing. "I think we need to try the front door." She sounded like she was trying not to cry again. I gave her a slow nod. I was dreading having to open it even more now that the thing outside was gone. I checked the peephole again, but it was still dark. I placed my hand around the doorknob and began to gently turn, quietly as possible. I felt the subtle click in my palm and slowly cracked the door open. I peeked through the sliver of space and gasped. I expected to see a hallway, but the door led straight outside. I opened it more to get a better view, revealing an empty field, just like what we were seeing through the window. No lights, no buildings, no cars, nothing in sight, nothing at all, except tall grass. Sydney pushed past me and stepped out the door, frantically looking around. She started hyperventilating, and I think she was having a panic attack. I tried to tell her to come back, but it was like she couldn't hear me. I started yelling, and still no acknowledgement. She was wandering out too far, and I was getting scared. Finally, I stepped out the door, walked up to her, and placed a hand on her shoulder. She flinched hard and spun around. When she looked at me, her eyes went wide and her face drained of all color. Then she let out an ear-splitting scream so loud my hands reflexively sprang up to my ears to cover them. She shot off in a dead sprint, and I turned around expecting something to be behind me, but there wasn't. Was she scared of me? When I turned back, she was already fading out of sight. I ran after her screaming, Sid, come back, please!" I chased her for a few minutes, but it was so dark I couldn't see anything. The only light source was coming from the dorm room door that was still left wide open. I completely lost sight of her. Scared and confused, I ran back to the door and noticed that it was just a door. I could see into the room, but there was no building on the outside. It just stood there like a portal between worlds. I rushed in, fearing that it would suddenly close at the last second and trap me in the field, but it didn't. I stood in the empty room trying to gather my thoughts. I hated myself for losing Sydney, but she had to come back, right? There was nowhere else to go. She had to come back. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw something pressed up against the glass of the window on the other side of the room. When I turned my head, it scurried out of sight. I could tell that it wasn't the figure from before. It was smaller and shaped differently. Then I remembered that the door was still open. I quickly darted over to it, and before I slammed it shut, I could hear a rustling on the grass growing closer. I locked the door, and almost immediately the handle started violently shaking. I screamed and fell to the ground, filled with terror. There was a muffled, angry moan from the other side. Whatever was out there started pounding on the door so hard that I thought for sure it would break right off the hinges. I scrambled back into the closet and shut it. I made myself as small as I could, cowering in the corner, and then began to sob uncontrollably. After a long time, the noises calmed down, but I didn't dare move. I don't know how long I sat there curled up on the floor. I think I must have lost consciousness at some point because I remember the feeling of waking up. I was in the same position, but my muscles felt stiff, like I hadn't moved for several hours. There were shadows moving under the door now. The feeling of dread washed over me again as I remembered the situation that I was still apparently trapped in. I stood up and made my way to the closet door. I pressed my ear up to the wood and jumped when I was met with 3 gentle knocks from the other side. "Who's there?" No reply. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to be polite and open the door, so I did. The thing on the other side was dressed in rags. Its gray skin was shriveled and its head was bald. It was like staring at rotten fruit, but in human form. I stepped into the room, which looked like it had been abandoned for years now. The paint was flaking, the ceiling was cracked, and the window was so dirty you couldn't see through it at all. The gray creature bowed its head to me like it was giving thanks, then entered the closet that I just exited. When the door closed, I noticed there were several more of them waiting in a line. They were all wearing similar clothing, old stained cloth poorly sewn together into makeshift cloaks. None of them looked at me. They all kept their heads down and seemed to be shivering. I think they were in pain. The way they clutched themselves shakily, the small raspy noises that came from them as they exhaled, it reminded me of being sick with the flu. At first I was scared, but then I felt pity. Not knowing what to do, I went to the front door again and looked through the peephole. To my surprise, the hallway was on the other side. I ripped the door open to discover that the rest of the building was in the same condition as the dorm room. I stepped out and peered down both ways of the hall, and then faced the room again. The gray, wrinkly things weren't shivering anymore. They stood up straight now, revealing how deceptively tall they were. Before, they wouldn't even look in my direction. Now, they were all silently making direct eye contact with me. It made me feel uneasy. I bowed my head slowly like the first one did to me, and then I closed the door on them. I'm not sure if that was the right move, but they were creeping me out. They didn't seem to be making any objections to me leaving, but either way I sprinted to the front entrance of the building and flung the doors open, only to be met with more disappointment. It was morning now, and all I could see in every direction was an endless expanse of grassy fields. I stared at the emptiness for a while, calling out Sydney's name and hoping that maybe she would hear me. I knew that I wouldn't get a response though. I turned around and began to take in the dormitory complex that used to be a really nice building. Now it looked like it had been rotting for decades. I decided to go back inside. Maybe those gray things could help me somehow. I didn't want to face them again, especially after how they were looking at me when I left, but I didn't know what else to do. Then I realized that I didn't actually know what door that was. If it was connected to Levi's, I guess that would make it 1114? I started making my way back in the direction I came from when I heard movement. I froze in place. It sounded like someone was rummaging through something metallic. Slowly, I tiptoed to the corner and peeked around it. The thing that was pressed up against the window last night was at the end of the hallway, attempting to get into the vending machines. I got a much better look at it this time, and the image will be forever burned into my brain. It had human skin and human limbs, but way too many of them. The way it crawled around was spider-like. Some of its arms were tiny and frail, while others were freakishly long and muscular. Its mouth and eyes were way too big for how small its bald head was, and the whole body was covered with dark bruises. I got the feeling that it wasn't always like this, some sort of terrible mutation experiment gone wrong? I don't know, but it was horrible to look at. It didn't seem to notice me, so I slowly crept towards room 1114. I got all the way down the hallway and made it to the door without making a sound. I was a lot closer to the creature now, but it was completely preoccupied with the vending machine still. Gently, I began to twist the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. I tried harder and it still wouldn't budge. They locked me out, I whispered to myself. Big mistake. The creature heard me even though I spoke so quietly. Its head jerked in my direction and suddenly I was staring into its deep black eyes. Neither of us moved for a second. Then it lunged forward. A dozen bony limbs scrambled into action, propelling the creature toward me at an unreal speed. I sprinted down the opposite way of the hall and it let out a deep, hateful moan as it pursued me. It was gaining on me and I knew that I wouldn't be able to outrun it. I had to think of something fast. I don't think I could successfully fight it, so the only other option was to hide. My own dorm room was coming up and I made the split decision to try it. Thank God the door was unlocked. I slammed it behind me as fast as I could and locked it. The creature was enraged and threw a tantrum just like it had done the night before. I sat on my bed, which was covered in a thick layer of dust now, and waited for the freakish thing to leave. Eventually it did. And that's when I heard something new. Coming from my own closet was the sound of radio chatter. I got up and quickly went to the back. I cried tears of relief when I found another door. Without wasting a second, I opened it and stepped through. 3 cops were staring at me like I was a ghost. I was back in Levi's room. The investigators were dumbfounded. They had already searched the closet and everything else in Levi's room, and here I was appearing out of it like fucking Houdini 6 hours later. They rechecked the closet after I returned, but the door at the end was gone again. Me and Levi were brought to the police station for questioning. I told them everything, and it must have sounded batshit crazy, but I wasn't the only one. All of the other students that went into the closet had already given their accounts. For a long time, Levi and I were the primary suspects in the Sydney Baker missing persons case. But they didn't have anything to go off of, and eventually it was all dropped. They even demolished the entire building, probably expecting to find her corpse in the walls or something, but nothing turned up. Now the only way of getting her back is destroyed. and every night I'm haunted by the thought of her being trapped in that hellscape. I've tried reaching out to Sydney's family, but they don't want anything to do with me. They blame me for her disappearance and probably think I killed her. I can't even be upset with them, it's the most logical explanation. I ended up dropping out of school and moving halfway across the country to distance myself from the trauma. My therapist suggested that I should write my story down. She thinks that it will help me find some sort of closure, but here we are at the end and I still feel as lost as ever. I haven't given up on Sydney. I don't think I ever will. I spend all my free time searching the internet for ways to get back to her. I've read hundreds of stories from people claiming to discover gateways that lead to other worlds, but none of them seem legit or similar to my experience. None of them except one. I've been messaging a guy named Chuck who claims to have found a place that shouldn't exist. He described it as infinite farmlands as far as the eye can see. It's the most promising lead I've had yet. I'm meeting up with Chuck next week. He strictly told me not to tell anybody about where this place is or how to access it, and I swore that I wouldn't. I know it sounds sketchy, but there's something about this guy. I think I believe him. The Closet in Dorm Room 1113 was written and narrated by Jared Archibald. Music production and sound editing by Tyler Archibald. Special thank you to Spencer, Elise, and Tyler. I hope you enjoyed the story, and thank you for listening.